Greg Madison, Lynn Preston. You've maybe seen the two of us have had a few dialogues, and today we're very pleased to welcome Lynn FLEISCH, who is also a focusing-oriented therapist. Each of us in our own different ways claim that title, but today we really would like to hear more from Glenn about in what way you see yourself as a focusing-oriented therapist.
And I'll just stick my 2 cents in here about how for focusing-oriented therapists, crossing Jen-Lynn's work with our own ideas and with other traditions is a central part of this, the value in this community. So all of us are crossing in different ways, and that's going to be very interesting.
Well, you know, back in ancient times, which is when I was in my late 20s, I guess, I came to California, and one of the missions, so to speak, was to get involved in much more philosophical and spiritual pursuits. So I was lucky enough to get into a graduate program which integrated phenomenology and psychoanalytic psychotherapy, which was pretty unique, right? And I didn't know anything about any of that, but it sounded intriguing. And that's how I got introduced to Jen-Lynn's work, was through this course on phenomenological psychology, psychotherapy. And I think the first article I ever read was called Experiential Phenomenology. Remember that one? But, wow, this is excellent. And so, and then I studied with many other teachers, including David Michael Levin, who you might know. I worked with him directly, and he in general were like my mentors for a long time. And and so then fast forward a bit, as I got licensed and started practicing, I went through my own personal crises, and somehow that focusing something stuck somewhere in me. And oh, one other thing, I was a graduate assistant for John Wellwood, who you might know is I have an East-West, and he actually was the first who introduced me to focusing per se. He was teaching a course on Buddhism and existential psychology, and I was his teaching assistant. I was in a doctoral program, and so he would do this thing, right? And I first thought it was meditation, and then he described where he learned it. And anyway, so when I went through my own crisis, this sort of came back to me, that I'd been in many therapies, but found them fairly unsatisfying. So then I looked up focusing, and I found Ann Weiser Cornell, who lived near me. And so that was my first experience, was as a client. And I just found it very intriguing and helpful. And it was like this, it opened up a whole world within me, my body. So that was the beginning. And then I trained with Anne for many years. And then I also trained with Kevin, as you may know, for a long time. And I also worked with Kevin individually for about 10 years, maybe. So I sort of learned it through my own process, right? And that, to me, so fast forward a little more, one of the things that's intrigued me, you know, focusing began, as you know, as at least as a practice therapeutically, based on, you know, the interviews with, or the recorded interviews with client-centered therapists, and then or clients, and then it went on. So most of focusing, see if you guys agree, would be, what does the client do or not do that helps facilitate growth, change, healing, right? But over the years, I've shifted that into, what is the therapist doing that's facilitating change? The client doesn't really have to do anything different than what they're already doing. It's me, how does the therapist facilitate?
I totally agree with you, Glenn, that that's how it's come down, but I don't
Mhm.
think ever meant by Gene to be that way, that the basis is the relatedness and the kind of interaction that we're making. But I totally agree. That's sort of how it became popularized, that it's about what the client does. And that research that's always quoted, emphasizes therapy is successful because of what the client can do.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, if you read, when I read Genlin, at least his early writings, always had two strands, and one was about more the focusing piece, and the second was the relational piece. There would usually be something about, like in the early articles on the experiential response, for example, the first part was about that, and the second part was about the relationality. And that part always interested and intrigued and invited me much more, because that did involve a kind of responsiveness from the other, right?
Right.
So that's sort of how I got involved. And then when I learned whole body focusing or practiced it, it sort of opened up another whole world within me, personally. And then I saw, for example, with many clients, it made a big difference if we invited each other to stand, for example. Simple, just, and I would always demonstrate and say, there are many ways we can process here together. Sitting and talking sort of is more conducive to verbalizing, right? And mentation, I think, or going in, of course. But I've had many, many examples where when you open the field to other possibilities of processing together, much more happens, seemingly, more energy, more engagement, even more intimacy, more energy, really. See, my main metaphor, I guess, is energy in therapy process. So, for example, I see felt sensing now really as energy bundles or energy configurations in our body. So that's one. So the whole body work really changed me personally, and also invited or allowed much more of standing as one, and also attention to gestures and postural shifts and tones of voice.
I want to underline that when I was reading your paper, and for people looking at the video, you just almost completed a wonderful paper about bodying forth and out, right? And the examples really struck me of starting with standing makes such a big difference, that you're starting from a different place when you invite someone to stand with you, and you're inviting a different kind of interaction when you're demonstrating some kind of movement or physical engagement.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, not all of it is standing. It could be sitting, lying down. We just open the whole field of possibilities. And this I actually learned when I did drama work and improv, because it's sort of uses our whole body.
Yeah. When I was reading your paper, there was two things that I wanted to ask if my impression was correct. One was, the influence of whole body focusing. Some of the examples seem very much like whole body focusing, and yet somehow slightly different. So I'm curious about the difference. The other thing that, I always hate it when people do that. They compare something that you're doing with other things they know, but that's exactly what I'm doing. So the other thing is kind of like a form of psychodrama or something almost Gestalt-ish, in the way of kind of taking other positions and seeing through a scenario with someone and letting things spontaneously come. And yet it also seemed a little bit different than I've seen that done before too. And I'm wondering if there's any way that you could help me understand those two differences, how it's similar to these things, but somehow new or fresh.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe for the people viewing that don't know what whole body focusing is, just a sentence about that.
Sure. Well, basically, the name says it. Whole body means that typically focusing has been a sort of more quiet process where we drop inside, right, and get a felt sense of something. So if I say, I'm feeling something and I don't know, what that is, but I'm really mad, or something like that, right? And then I'll stay with it, and through those reflections, no, it's not mad, it's right. So there's a chain of technically it'd say signifiers, but things that reflect or describe a bodily sense. Right? So and that's always retained. See, that's important. In my work, whatever grows always comes back to the root. So it don't ever. That's always there in the background, right?
That root of the deep listening and the felt sense as primary, and that process of how it transforms step by step.
Right, exactly. And whole body focusing, basically, it is done standing, but it doesn't need to be. It can be any position, but it really basically uses our body more. Not just goes inside, as the body is like a retainer or container of energy or life force or information, but that we can. So like I'm gesturing, so that's a kind of way of attending or attuning to the whole body in motion, you could say, in action, in experiencing. So that's basically, there's much more, but that's basically what it involves. The first time I experienced it with Kevin at a retreat decades ago, it was like a whole different experience. It was like, wow, this is different. In a way that was intriguing and brought much more experiencing, right? To me, one of the hallmarks of focusing is, focusing therapy is experiencing, right? Deepening, expanding. Well, the more we use our whole body, the more, to me, we have direct experiential engagement and exploration. So that's basically what that means. Now, Greg, you asked, how is what I was presenting, like in the paper, or what I do, similar or different than that, or is that right?
It felt to me like it was an elaboration in some way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it helped me because, I went back and started looking at some of my old notes from from 10 years ago or more. And I can see there is a difference. It was often like, whether it was standing or sitting, I would just invite the client into a whole body, or myself also, whole body awareness, standing, feel your feet, your legs. You start from a physical sense of being here, right? And then I would sort of just be an active listener. They would move their body and I would reflect back. Oh, I see your shoulders moving. Maybe notice that. And just see what comes when you pay attention to that, and so on. And that's still there. See, each thing builds. But over I'd say 10, 15 years, I see what happens in the body more in the form of a story or a drama that's playing out. And so a particular movement isn't just a movement or an inner being that has a certain experience. It's sort of interlinked with a much bigger story, which is explored through the body. So it's not psychodrama, right, which is a different quality. But it has to do with being very aware of, and myself, when I listen, I actually feel a story. I don't know if that makes sense. I see or feel, oh, that